Hello, everybody, and welcome back to That's Comical. I, of course, am Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome, and I am very excited for this specific video because this is the second installment of a segment over here on this channel that April actually created, but we never actually gave it a proper name. But, of course, you know, me being the person where the hamsters on the proverbial wheels never stop turning, I thought it would be fun to give this segment a name, and I call it Who Wore It Best, where we take a look at a beloved story from its source material and compare it to its other media counterpart. And of course, as always, if you are watching today and it happens to be Wednesday, happy new comic book day. And of course, for this panel, the conversation is going to get fun as it always does because Cammie and Andy are here. Thanks for coming back, guys. It's a pleasure to have you guys. Always love talking with you about this stuff.
You know it.
Nice to be here.
And of course, we want to thank each and every one of you who are here today. So if you are and you want to leave a comment, please do so. And don't forget to leave a thumbs up as well. And if you want to see all the other stuff that's happening over here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you are up to date with all of our latest content, because there is a lot of content on the way in 2022, because it's crazy to believe that we are almost at the end of 2021. And I am just happy that the three of us are here because we are finally going to put Batman the Long Halloween to bed, and I am finally going to be able to read Dark Victory. So we have discussed Batman the Long Halloween as a comic book series. Cammie and I had our DC animated live show where we reviewed the Long Halloween films parts 1 and 2 and tried our hardest not to compare the two to the source material, because today we are finally comparing the comic book to the films. So I really think I want to start this conversation with Cammie because Cammie adores this comic book. So Cammie, it is time for you to finally let it all out. How do you feel about these films in comparison to the source material, just as a whole, before we get into the nitty-gritty?
They do not even hold a candle. Honestly, this was the first comic book that I found myself completely immersed in. I was turning pages faster than I could honestly hold the book in my hand. Let me preface by saying, because I know, Andy, this is always a question you have for me, how did I first come about it? And it was actually digitally on this one. This was just shortly after I had seen you all talk about the Three Jokers, and there was some discussion about, you know, other source material that you should probably read, and this was mentioned, and I thought, oh, Halloween, Batman, this is my cup of tea. And I didn't realize just how enriching and amazing this story was. The entire thing from top to bottom, not only the imagery, obviously the illustrations, the coloring, the dialogue, and the darkness. I mean, this really truly is one of, in my opinion, the best Batman stories ever written. And I just gobbled it up, and I've read it now 5 times since you all did that discussion for a multitude of reasons, obviously, as Steve just mentioned. But this is one that I can definitely see myself reading annually. I mean, this is just that good. That's
interesting that you point that out, Cammie, how you read it. You know, I do always love to know that. I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about the Long Halloween lately, and you know, I think, you know, in short, I prefer the original comic to the movie. I think the movie was fairly well done, about as well done as it probably could have been. But it just doesn't work for me in the same way. You know, I got a lot of thoughts about why that is. That's kind of the long and the short of it, even though I did enjoy myself watching the movie.
Yeah, I mean, as myself, someone who is a fan of Batman, but also someone who praises DC animation from Warner Brothers. I mean, the fact that I have a segment on my original YouTube channel dedicated to just DC animation, and the fact that Marvel and other comic books companies that have given us some of their creations in animation don't even get their own shows, that says a lot about what DC and Warner Brothers really are about when it comes to their mission about bringing animated versions of these iconic godlike characters to the small screen for so many different audiences, and sometimes to a degree the big screen. And because of the fact that Cammie and I go into more detail on these films on the DC Animated Live Show, it is just incredible to see such a dedicated group of fans. So it's always interesting when you find out that they are going to take an iconic Batman story and adapt it to an animated small screen format. Sometimes they get it really right, and sometimes they get it really wrong, and sometimes they just get somewhere in between. And for me, that's where I think the Long Halloween films lie. I think that on a positive note, what they definitely do correctly is they capture the atmosphere that the comic book gives us. They definitely capture the way that the characters are represented. I think that they did a great job with that. And to a certain degree, even though it is always so challenging, but that's what DC Animation does so well, they did their very best to capture that Tim Sale art in animated form. I think the best embodiment of Tim Sale's work in that animated film is hands down the way the Joker was drawn. I thought that the way that the Joker looked was very much like how he looks in the Jeff Loeb Tim Sale comic. But I definitely will agree with you. As much as I do enjoy the films, I think the books are definitely better just because there's always more depth and more directions that you can go. Though I will definitely get into a couple of things later that I think the movie did a little bit better than the book, and I just think that it served certain characters correctly. But those are my overall thoughts. So I think it's a pretty much overall consensus that we all believe the book is better than the film.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's about it.
But I think that we could also agree that if you did not want to compare them, because that's another thing that I personally do. I mean, the one franchise that I always have been saying to people these days now, do not compare the books to the films because they really are separate entities. That's the Harry Potter world. I will always look at the films now separately from the books because I love both in those two formats, no matter what. And I will definitely say that as a film set, it's definitely one of the stronger Batman adaptations that we have gotten in DC animation in recent years.
In terms of comparing the book to the movie, I always tell people never to do that because, you know, it always reminds me of that imagery that you see from time to time pop up on social media of that iceberg, and you have that tip and it kind of shows you, you know, book, movie kind of thing. And you can really take that either way, depending on if you're more of a book person or you're more of a cinema, you know, goer or what have you. But I think that going into a movie, you need to understand that this is the vision of the person that interprets it from their point of view. So you're always going to get differences. There's always going to be things that stand out more to say, you know, you, Andy, than I, or Steve, than I. And there's nothing wrong with that because it's something that resonates with you as a reader. And then, of course, if you are a film goer and a movie creator, then that's something that you're choosing to highlight. So, in terms of animation, though, yeah, Steve and I have been on this journey for a little over a year now, and I have been accustomed to seeing some amazing DC animation that I probably would have never given the time of day because I was very tunnel visioned when it came to DC animation. And so now being, you know, exposed to all of this, I do look at animation in a very different way. You know, I think that in terms of comparing the books to the movies, that's natural. As a reader, you're going to do that. You're going to look for your favorite parts. You're going to see how it translated from the visionary of the writers and the producers. But this was, you know, one that was definitely on my radar because when you love something as much as we all love this, you want it to be done right. You want there to be justice to be done because you realize that some people won't pick up the comic and that's all they're going to do is watch the movie. So you hope that in those moments, in those 90 minutes or what have you, that they're sitting there in front of the television screen, that they're getting the full impact of the story. So for that, I can definitely say I do think it tells the story. It's just not as enriching as when you read it, because there's just something magical that happens within the pages of this particular comic book series.
And it's very interesting that you said that, Cammie, because of the fact that when DC and Warner Brothers were starting to do these specific films, when they really started to tackle the comic books and some of the most iconic stories that they had specifically with Batman. Their big one, of course, was Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, and shortly after that, Batman Year One. Now, I mentioned those two, and I see Andy's eyes brighter than the Northern Lights at this point in time, because these are two of his favorite Batman stories because he loves Frank Miller.
Yeah.
They didn't change a thing. These were page-to-screen perfection. But then The Killing Joke comes out a couple of years later, and then they start doing a couple of interesting, weird tweaks. And then you get this one, and right before that, another iconic Jeff Loeb story, Batman Hush. Different. So I was a little bit surprised that this was exactly what we were getting. And I also keep forgetting to throw Batman Gotham by Gaslight in there. I don't know why I keep forgetting that, but one of the few things that I definitely am going to say is that we're going to be doing a lot more of these shows in the coming years. And I think for the sake of the type of reader that you are, Andy, and the newer but soon-to-be veteran reader that you are, Cammie, I am very curious to see what our attitudes will be when we take a look at some of these adaptions. I mean, one of the few things that the comic book community is actually saying, and I'm really sorry that I'm going to take a quick tangent, but I almost forgot. We should have done this earlier. We need to dedicate this specific show to a living legend that unfortunately is going to be leaving us very soon. And that, of course, is famed comic book writer George Perez. He is responsible for some of the greatest DC comic book stories ever told, including what some may call the greatest, which is Crisis on Infinite Earths. We just found out that he has terminal cancer and that he will not be with us very soon. And the comic book community is just heartbroken. DC animation fans, you know, those of you who are fans of the Teen Titans, you know, you can thank George Perez because this was one of his babies. He is responsible for some of the characters that came out of the 80s. Fantastic work. And the rumor that I just found out about is that DC Animation is anticipating creation of their very first animated film trilogy, and it seems that it's going to be Crisis on Infinite Earths. And all I'm going to say is they better do it right for George Perez. They must.
It's a very worthwhile tangent. Good to point out. And obviously excited for that 3-part series, all things aside, and hope it's done well.
I mean, I was saying to people, I wouldn't be surprised if that was a story that we would get, because I'd like to see them take on a trilogy, because The Long Halloween is not the first duology of films. I mean, this is the third one. And I like the fact that they sometimes do this, because it shows you that sometimes a story in its entirety is not going to last for just 90 minutes. There's so much more. Another one that I completely forgot to mention was we also saw adaptions of Under the Red Hood and to a certain degree Death in the Family. So a lot of Batman stories have been given to us in animation, and sometimes to do more than just one film just is better for the story's adaptation. And that's why I feel that we needed The Long Halloween to be broken up into two, because it is a story that really can be told in 2 parts.
And I just want to say there's something, you know, I kind of picked up on what you were saying, Steve, when you say, like, to a certain extent, Death in the Family, and Cammie, when you were talking about how difficult it can be to reasonably compare book and film when they were created with different purposes, and, you know, there's a different vision behind them. And the thing that I would say to push back on that a little bit with this particular example is that I really do feel like what DC tried to do with this and with a lot of their animated films is they are really trying to purely adapt the source material into a different medium. And I find that distinct from, you know, it's an easy to draw upon example, but you look at like the Marvel movies, and while they've been pulling from source material in a lot of cases, you know, like there's a Civil War movie, but it really very surface level resembles the Civil War comics. Same with Winter Soldier. Same, you know, that's the thing. They pull these ideas and rather than adapt them, they kind of interpret them for the screen. And what DC has really been doing is truly adapting the source material and just trying to do an animated version of what the original was. And I think it's for that reason that I'm a little more critical about the Long Halloween animated film than I would have been if it was a little more its own beast. I understand that there were a lot of major narrative changes, but they were, to me at least, still kind of in the surface level realm. Like it's at its heart the same story with similar plot beats, just a couple of twists thrown in for longtime fans. You know, I think that's why things like it's got a great art style, but it's not Tim Sale's art. And so I'm going to criticize the movie for the fact that the comic looks better and is more interesting, even though obviously, how could it accomplish that? But the thing is, it was trying to accomplish that. And so I will criticize it for not reaching that high mark, even though I realize reaching that high mark was, for all intents and purposes, impossible. But since they tried, I need to say they didn't hit it. You know what I mean? That's the kind of criticism I have for it.
2 responses to that. That is why I love the fact that in the opening credits of both movies, you do get glimpses of the actual comic book, because they're saying, hey, look, this is the comic book. Like, we want you to read this comic book. And the other thing is, there's going to be a Who Wore It Best Civil War episode coming very soon, because, Cammie, I'm sure that you have seen Captain America Civil War.
Yeah, I dove into more of the Marvel catalog after I finished the DC catalog, at least the live action films. So I tried to get a little Marvel in there, especially since one of our counterparts here had said that we're a little DC, not privileged, but like we give DC more of the limelight here. So I tried to give Marvel some of the time. So I'm subconsciously trying to watch more Marvel and read more Marvel material.
Yeah, let me just tell you one thing. When you read Civil War, even if it's just the core story, which is just 7 issues, you're going to see a big difference from the film. Even with Infinity War. I mean, I'm definitely going to want to talk about Infinity War at some point in time. I think the thing about DC, the reason why we're giving it more attention is probably just because of the fact that DC as a whole, when it comes to their storytelling, they really know how to capture a story and really just like still keep it grand, but still keep it very tight knit. Like with Marvel, as someone who reads a lot of different stories, especially events from the big 2, I end up having to go to further tie-ins with Marvel stories just because they're purposely trying. I think that when it comes to their storytelling, Marvel is trying to get you to buy more comics. So it's like when they give you a story, like right now, a perfect example is they're doing a story called Devil's Reign, but there are like 30 tie-ins. But am I going to read all those tie-ins? Absolutely not. With DC, it seems to be a little more close-knit. So like you can get like one tie-in there and one tie-in here, and you're still going to get what you think would be a complete story. You don't need to venture out as massively as you do with Marvel. But another thing that's very interesting that you mentioned, Andy, is the fact that it seems to be that when it comes to animation or when it comes to small screen media as opposed to big screen media, even Marvel tried their very best to adapt the stories a little bit closer to the comics. If you watch like the 1990s X-Men and Spider-Man series, and you take a look at their episodes that focused on the Dark Phoenix saga for X-Men or the Black Costume saga for Spider-Man, they really tried to adapt it closely to the comic book. And maybe that's just because of the fact that animation just has that power and that flexibility, because when it comes to animation, you can basically create anything the mind of man can conceive. That's what Walt Disney said. But when you're doing it live action, I mean, maybe nowadays you can, because when you take a look at Spider-Man movies and you see what Spider-Man can do, or when you watch Zack Snyder's Justice League and you see that final battle, there are some things that look like they come straight out of a panel from a comic book. But with animation, I feel that you have the flexibility and the wiggle room to really create those impossible moments that you can only see in the pages of a book or in a cartoon. I'm just saying, I'm just thinking it that way.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know if you guys agree or disagree.
I agree. That makes a lot of sense. And I think part of it is, I mean, just the nature of it still having a drawn element, I think makes people feel like it's closer to the source material, and there's ways that they would try to recreate it that'll be closer to the source material, and they don't need to worry about making it seem more grounded in reality, or you can still kind of stretch, you know, suspension of belief in a different way with animation than you can with a real life thing. But you know, like I said, still art style, it's still impossible to use the level of detail, and Tim Sale's art is made for still frame. A moving Tim Sale's art, just something about it just doesn't land correctly. It's the same way, look, this group talked about Kingdom Come recently, right?
Yes.
I mean, what the hell does an animated version of Kingdom Come look like? You know, that scratches any of the itch. You know what I mean? Like you could tell the story, but it's very different. And I think that's happening to the same kind of degree here. It's just maybe Kingdom Come reads as a more extreme example in my mind's eye of what that difference would be, but it carries over here.
Yeah, because when you take a look at Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns and you take a look at the animated film, they really try to capture Frank Miller's art. When you see Justice League New Frontier, it's also because of the fact that Darwin Cook, before he passed away, was one of the people who was on the staff of creating that animated film, and it looks just like it came out of his comic book. It's gorgeous. And I think that the movie adds a little bit more while some parts of it were taken away, but that's another story for another time. All-Star Superman really captures Frank Quietly's art very, very well. But if they're ever going to make a Kingdom Come movie, which they should, let me make that clear, they should, I think that they should do it in Bruce Timm's animation style, because I think the fans would just absolutely love that.
I'm with you.
So I was just thinking about how we were going to tackle the comparisons here, and I think I have a really fun idea. I'm tapping into an old football show that I had way back when, like in 2012, with two of my best buddies. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to keep doing the comparing and contrasting, but when the one thing that comes up that really, really got your goat, I want you to just get on there and just like interrupt and just say, here is why I don't like this, or here's why I absolutely love this. I think that that's the best way that we can go about it.
Okay. Sounds good.
So we're going to go by holidays. I think that that's the best way to tackle this show. So we're going to start off, obviously, with Halloween. And basically, we get something very similar right off the bat, but we also get something very different. I mean, the comic book starts with a dinner party. A birthday party, actually. And the movie just starts off with Carmine Falcone and Bruce Wayne talking to each other, and then we get our first murder of the holiday killer. So very interesting way to still get to the point of this story, but do it in very different ways.
Yeah, and this was one of those parts of the story that I feel like, you know, and any change there is more for the flow of the medium and to keep it from being, you know, a 4 or 5 part movie. You know, they need to be able to cut things down a little bit and get to the meat of it. I found nothing about this, you know, controversial.
Yeah. I mean, I think what was very interesting was the fact that Selena Kyle, aka Catwoman, shows up pretty much right at the beginning, and she has a little bit of a delayed introduction in the films. And also there's a character named Richard Daniel who is completely non-existent. I mean, honestly, him not being there didn't take anything away from the story, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And I think Catwoman is an interesting thing. We talked about Catwoman a little bit in our original video where we talked about just the comic. And I think that one of the biggest choices that they made kind of globally across the two films was to center Catwoman a little bit more. In part 2, they did that by kind of pulling in some elements of Dark Victory, which I realize, Steve, you haven't read, and Cammie, I'm assuming you haven't read, but we haven't talked if you went on and read that after our last. Okay.
We are.
Well, they tugged on a couple pieces of Dark Victory in part 2 in order to give her more to do, as well as just making her more present in comparison to the comic. So I thought that was a really favorable change for the films.
Yeah, this was one that I wasn't disappointed with in terms of the film. I think that, like Andy said, you can't really give every single detail, but what the film did very well here, since we do visit Halloween twice within the series, is that I think it gave a little bit more at the end, which is fitting. It kind of allotted for that marrying of all the different seasons. And honestly, introducing Selena Kyle a little bit later in the film worked for me as well, because the dialogue and the nature of the reason she's in this story, I think, really was in the center of the story and not so much at the beginning. So missing out on her in the beginning of the film really wasn't a waste of her storyline. I think it enriched her story, if anything, in terms of telling it and the purpose as to why she was present. So I thought the beginning of the film was done fairly well.
Yeah, and there were two things that they did add to the film that I personally really liked. I really liked how they gave a lot more to Alfred in this story, particularly at the beginning where they have him looking for trick-or-treaters. I kind of really like that, but I think the part that I loved about the scene in the movie is when he's talking to Bruce and Bruce is talking back to him, and then Bruce just turns his back to him and goes, "Hey, do you think that?" And then all of a sudden he's not there. I'm like, oh, wow, that is really funny, because we have to remember that this is supposed to be taking place during year 2 of Batman being Batman. And Andy, the comic historian who got Batman read to him at bedtime, definitely vouches for that because he knows this lore more than we do. Another thing that I thought was really nice was to add Barbara to the story, because the funny thing about Barbara is that sometimes she is Jim's niece, sometimes she's Jim's daughter. She's been really changed in so many different ways, but I love the fact that we got her and her little brother a little bit older as opposed to his son being a newborn, because I think it just added a little bit more to Jim as a family man, but also, of course, a foreshadowing for the fans saying, yes, this is going to be Batgirl, having her dress up as a cop for Halloween. I thought that was just a really nice touch, because I think that characters like Alfred and Jim Gordon are not as humanized, if that's the right word, in the book as they are in the film. They serve their purpose well, but I think the film just adds a little bit more to them, because we've seen these characters all the way back in animated form to Batman the Animated Series, and we get so much more of them. They're just as important as Batman in the animated forms, and that's why I think adding these little things to them made it much more enjoyable.
Agree completely.
Well, kind of touching on what you and Andy said earlier in terms of marrying two ideas about, focusing on DC over Marvel, and then kind of the reality perspective that DC offers. That's a perfect example of it, because I think that what DC manages to do is, when they do tell a story on film, they are able to kind of give this this very vibrant storyline between the dialogue. There's so much focus on the dialogue between characters, which adds to the reality base of it. And I think that's why I personally have gravitated towards DC over Marvel all these years, because I do feel that it closely mimics what it would be if Batman and Commissioner Gordon were real people, and this would be the type of conversation that they would have. And it is gritty and it is dark, and I think that it allots for that development and understanding. So even if a character per se doesn't get a lot of screen time and or page time, you yourself, being an avid reader and then a continual watcher of the animation versions of it, you're constantly playing this in your head anyways, kind of remembering these conversations that they've had in other scenes and scenarios. And so you can kind of even allot it to play out a little bit on your own, even if the dialogue might not be there in the film, or if the page time isn't there. At least that's how I feel. I feel like I have such a relationship with Commissioner Gordon and Bruce Wayne at this point, that we're buds.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that I like about the movie is that it adds a little bit of lightheartedness to the film thanks to these characters. I mean, I thought it was adorable when he gives Barbara his badge and then he says, all right, so who's driving? And he gives the keys to her. I thought that was just a really cute little thing to add to it. It doesn't have to be there, but I think it just, again, it adds more of a human aspect to Jim.
Mm-hmm.
So when we move on to Thanksgiving, this is where things really start to change. And Thanksgiving, it's very interesting because we see a hit put out on Harvey Dent. And the funny thing is, in the book, Gilda goes to the hospital, and in the movie, it's Harvey who goes to the hospital. But I think one of the other things that was very interesting to me was the character of Mickey, because he is completely changed from a nationality standpoint. He goes from a member of the Irish mob to a Chinese hitman from Gotham's chapter of Chinatown. I mean, was that something that was going to take away from the story? Not necessarily. I don't think it was going to add to it either, but I just got to ask, why did they do that? Did they have to?
I don't know. I kind of liked it. I didn't think it added or took away very much. It kind of made Gotham feel more alive to me. And it kind of made me feel like the world was bigger than the mob as it was portrayed in the comics a little bit. It's one of those things where I don't think it really mattered. I'm sure people can have different thoughts on that one, but for me, it really kind of gave like a little bit of a spark where there wasn't anything. It was more like kind of by rote, yes, keep the story going. It gave me a glimpse of something, so I found it fun.
I mean, for Cammy, the mob fanatic here, I mean, right. I think that that's an interesting thing because we all have to keep remembering that the mob is not just an entity that stays within the world of Italian heritage. There are so many versions of the mob in so many different nationalities all over this world. And from what I have been told by some people out there, if you think that the Italian mob is brutal, you have no idea.
I think the Italian mob was brutal for a period of time, but I think that once we hit kind of the drug era of the Italian mafia, that kind of all went away. Their clout changed, their focus changed. Therefore, their imagery and strong arm that they were, they're tough, and I kind of, rank them pretty high in terms of the brutality that the Irish mob holds. So for me, yeah, it was a disappointment that was changed in the film, because I was really looking for that dynamic. Being the mob person that I am, I really enjoy seeing that screen time. I do agree with Andy. It does add a different element. It does give it a different feel. So I wasn't disappointed that it went that route, because it didn't change the film so dramatically for me that I was like, oh, that took away from the story. Again, it kind of adds that layer. And when you're doing a book to movie comparison, it's like, okay, this works too. I think had it fallen flat in terms of dialogue and the way that it moved the story, then I would probably be complaining a little bit more. But yeah, the mob girl in me really would have liked to have seen that. But again, we don't really know why the vision was changed, and it worked okay, but I did miss that.
Right. I mean, they didn't really do anything to Solomon Grundy. They kept him the same. By the way, guys, I'm going to need you to help me add more if I forget something, because I'm hoping that you guys can catch me where I fall here.
Oh, yeah. But I will say that my favorite change between the two movies was having it be Harvey that goes to the hospital.
I agree.
Instead of Gilda. And
I agree.
It's a like unexciting change, but it's my favorite change because there's an argument to be made that it's a plot hole in the original like Long Halloween that I just kind of accept and deal with and figure like this is how it happened, so this is how it happened. But it's my favorite change, for as like arguably minor as it is that she was not the one who went to the hospital at this moment.
I think for Harvey, I think what it does is Harvey going to the hospital, it just basically is causing him to get all of that pent up rage through this that is eventually going to turn him into Two-Face. I mean, everyone has to keep remembering that the story of Long Halloween is really Harvey's origin story to becoming Two-Face. So it's literally him getting chipped away and chipped away and chipped away every little bit and in every single chapter. So the fact that he's the one that ends up having to go to the hospital just adds to the drama that's going on in Harvey's head. And eventually it's going to be the birth of Two-Face. So then let's move on to Christmas, because Christmas is where the Joker shows up. And I think that the book adds a lot more to Joker than the movie does. I mean, don't get me wrong. They still give us that exact Joker that we got in the book. And I think when we originally talked about the source material, we were wondering, how is the Joker going to fit in a story that is so grounded and a story that seems more real? But the truth of the matter is, as we all agreed, what's so interesting about The Long Halloween is you see a Gotham that is more grounded when it comes to its troubles, but we also see, because of the fact that Batman is here, it causes this troublesome stuff that is very structured to go into chaos. And Joker is the powder keg that basically gets it started, because the Joker is out there for his own vendetta. He's the one that's hunting down the holiday killer. He's the one in the book that's literally playing the Grinch. He is the one that is killing the mobsters. You don't see him really doing that much. And I think what's also very interesting is, in the book, Batman doesn't know who the Joker is yet. But in the movie, it seems like Batman and the Joker have met up a couple of times before.
Which they had to do. That was a change they needed to make, because this couldn't be a Joker movie, because The Long Halloween isn't a Joker story. And so they kind of needed to do that, so it wasn't doing any more heavy lifting than it needs to. They just rely on the fact, well, obviously the audience knows the Joker. So I think it was perfectly fine how they handled it. But if you want to say something that the books, were able to do better, it's that there just isn't the time to devote to the Joker being a major force in this film. It's just not possible.
Because he's not really a major force in the book either. He's just basically there he's honestly there as a distraction. He doesn't think he's there as a distraction. He's just trying to be the center of attention, as he always is.
Of course.
Yeah, I was just going to call him an attention whore, because that's what Joker does very well. Yeah. There was a few standout characters, the Joker being one, and obviously we see him for the first time here, but you had also mentioned Solomon Grundy in the previous chapter of Thanksgiving. I thought they also executed his introduction and the way they used him in both the movie and the comic very well. I thought the Joker was done well. You get a lot more in-depth of the Joker and his storyline in the comic, but that's, given the time. And another character that we're introduced to also here in Christmas is the Calendar Man, and I think that he was given great screen time as well, and he just added that nice little niche of sinister necessity in this film. And I think that the storyline was very well executed from the pages to the screen in terms of those three characters. So that's just my take.
Yeah, Calendar Man is a character that, unless you're a diehard Batman fan, you have no idea who he is. So the fact that he is an essential, well, the funny thing is, he is sort of an essential and he's sort of not an essential. He sort of wants to be the essential. I mean, I still think that he is there just like to move the plot along for the heroes, but sometimes he gets those really fun little nuggets. Like, again, going back to the lighthearted comedy that you get from the movie that you don't get from the book, I just like the scene at the very end of the story in the film with Calendar Man where he's like, it's the 31st day of the 10th month of the year. And then the guard goes, and then he goes, Taco Tuesday. Like, that's just funny.
It's also funny because I think Calendar Man being like, only diehard fans know, Calendar Man is such an underutilized and niche character that I consider Calendar Man is a character that only diehard fans know, because of the Long Halloween. Like, yes, he exists outside of it, but it's hilarious. Like, anybody who thinks Calendar Man, their first thought is, oh yeah, the guy from the Long Halloween.
And
like,
I think what's actually kind of funny is there was actually a meta moment in another DC animated film, Injustice, just a few months later, where I forgot which character it was, like, no, Batman's the one that goes against the Joker and the Bane and whoever this guy is. And you see his Calendar Man. I was like laughing my head off. I was like, if I did not watch The Long Halloween or read The Long Halloween just before I watched Injustice, I would have not found that as funny as it was. I thought that was a hilarious meta moment.
And then he gets all sad too. He's like, oh.
Yeah, because that's exactly what he's like in The Long Halloween. He's like, will someone pay attention to me?
Yeah.
And he doesn't, and that's the thing, because he wants to be his own character. He doesn't want to be the crazy person that the Joker is. He's got that Hannibal Lecter feel to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, he wants to help. It's so funny. Like, he's trying to help Batman because he's trying to say, ooh, if I actually help the good guys, maybe they'll notice me a little bit more. Another character that I think was very interesting, the movie did add a little bit more to him, was Alberto. And this is the point of the story where Alberto really seems to come a little bit more into the Falcone story. But the funny thing is, when it comes to getting into New Year's Eve, up until this point, he shows up a couple of times in the comic, but he doesn't seem to get much time. Like, what I really appreciate about Alberto in the film is there's a lot more banter between him and his father.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
For obvious, well, I mean, if we're on New Year's Eve, then I'll just get into it. But it's interesting that they include more of that banter because, you know, I think one of the complaints about the original is, you know, twists and identity of Holiday in the comic is more played as a gotcha. There wasn't a lot of foreshadowing and evidence provided. And so I think the major changes about the Holiday Killer in this animated film are really a response to that. You know, I already said that my favorite change was making it that Harvey was the one who was in the hospital on Thanksgiving. And that's all tied to that too. It gives you more opportunities to identify the Holiday Killer. And when Alberto is killed on screen and brutally at this point in New Year's Eve, you know, and this is like the end of part one, essentially, you know, we move on from there. I think anybody who had read the comics at that point, now I'm curious because, you know, I want to see if you guys did have the same takeaway, but that was the moment where I thought, okay, the big change here is it's just Gilda. Like that's the big change that we're doing. That's how we're like making this its own thing from the comic. And then at that point I was like, what are we going to do to make Gilda more of a character? Since seemingly they made Alberto more of a character just to shock people who had read the comics when he dies.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Because one of the things that I think what they did was they took the whole Alberto story and they replaced it with what we actually get in the comics. Because one of the few things that we definitely see more so in the comic is the mob war. You really do see that there is a big rivalry between the Falcone and the Maroni family. You get that so much more. What's also very interesting is what we also get is a character named Vernon who is working for Harvey Dent, and he is already picking out suspects. And at that point in time, Alberto is not even pegged, and they're already starting to investigate Bruce Wayne. That's what's so interesting about that part of the story. And the other interesting thing is the fact that what they tried to do very much so was they tried to show us the relationship between Harvey Bruce as Batman and Jim Gordon, how they had that big meeting on the rooftop, and then after New Year's Eve when Alberto is killed, you have that new meeting between the three of them, and you see like there's some tensions actually happening. At this point in time, those three characters are actually on their separate ways, and Batman has actually pegged Alberto as a suspect, which is absolutely crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But you're absolutely right, Andy.
By the way, Cammy, I want to ask, because this feels like the natural time to dig into it more. By killing off Alberto, making Gilda more central now for the entirety of the killings, since that did change the nature of the murders coming from being more about the Falcone-Maroni crime war, what did that do to the story for you? Because it for me, there's two things happening in the book, The Long Halloween. One is it's a grounded Batman mystery that's kind of that crime family, low fantasy Batman detective story. And then the other is, at the same time, since this is essentially a Batman year 2, showing the rise of the, for lack of a better word, supernatural foes of Batman that slowly start to take the limelight, and doing that thing like the presence of Batman is like part of the catalyst of making Gotham crazier. So for you, what did you think about this change, which decentralizes the mob further?
It's almost like sometimes our brains are in sync when we're having these conversations, because that was my next thought point is that this really does continue to change that mob perspective. But I didn't hate it, because it did for the movie what it needed to do. We got a more enriching story about his son. We understood the dynamic of the relationship that they didn't have, and why things turned out the way that they did. Because I think one of the most common points of reference that I would have reading the story is comparing the Falcones to the Corleone family. And so by doing that, I was constantly looking at those comparisons, the father-son dynamic. Obviously the Corleones had the 3 sons, so there was a lot more dialogue going on there and who's going to take over the family. But this one, immediately I was like, wow, what's wrong with the son? Why doesn't the son get to carry on? Why is he so brutal? And the movie just completely opens up that dialogue, and we get to see that, and it enriches Gilda's story so much better. So for that, even though you would think it would kind of upset me, I was kind of already turned off when we didn't get the Irish mob, so I knew it was going to be less mob-centric. And so I kind of appreciated the fact that they gave these 2 characters more of that build-up. And the change, I wasn't that disappointed with it. I thought it worked very well cinematically for the duration of the film. It really did carry on that season, and in a way it almost kind of made Father's Day a little bit more enriching too, because I felt like in the movie Mother's Day and Father's Day were so blended, and it just went so fast. It just carried from Mother's Day into Father's Day, and I was like, but
we'll get to that.
Because we got that enriching story, I didn't care for that, but because we did get this kind of backstory so early on in New Year's Eve, that I felt like it's okay. I mean, because we do have to rush the plot a little bit faster in a movie version, it worked. So I wasn't fully disappointed.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying. I kind of read it that way, and I think that the strongest thing they did with that choice was, in doing so, they realized they were primarily telling a story about the rise of the unusual Batman foe. And so, not to get too ahead of ourselves, but when we get to like the conflict in Falcone's office, like in the apartment, like late in the movie, like it has already gone so off the rails, and he has so completely lost control of the situation there in a way that is not the case in the comic. When we were talking about our review just of the comic, I remember one of the things I wanted to talk about is that, great centralized shot with like Batman's whole rogues gallery there behind the desk with Falcone. And like, for obvious reasons, we don't get that that shot in the movie. And I think that it was very smart that they let the choice that they made here about what they were going to center kind of build and be the focus and naturally impact the rest of the story. They didn't make this twist and then tell the story as it continues on in the comic. They let it live and breathe and be its own thing in that sense, at least. And so that I thought was pretty well handled.
Right. And then what's very interesting is this is where the first of the two movies actually ends. And I still remember Andy and I actually watched part one for the first time together. And when we saw the movie coming to an end, I still remember, Andy, what you said. You were like, oh, we're stopping here now. You know, I remember, yeah, because this is a 13-book series, and we finished the first movie at the end of book 5, sort of at the beginning of book 6, because the movie adds a little bit of Valentine's Day to the ending of the film. And basically, it's where Poison Ivy shows up. And again, what's also very interesting is this is where Alfred first shows up in the books, which is so crazy. It's basically when Harvey and Jim are going over to Wayne Manor to interview Bruce to find out a little bit more about him, about what happened with him on New Year's, and we don't get that right away. What we get is Alberto's funeral in the film, and Carmine goes to Bruce and says, have you met my new associate? And then the movie ends with that post-credit scene. So then we get to Valentine's Day in full force, and then we get to St. Patrick's Day in full force, and then we get to April Fool's Day in full force. Do you see where I'm going with this? Because we still seem to, right now, have a little bit more positivity about the movie than we do for the book. So I'm like wondering where the rage is. Well, here's where the rage comes for me. Because I didn't really like the fact that we basically started to just blend all of these events together. It's like it was creative, where we basically decided that Bruce Wayne has been and Batman has been missing for almost 3 months, whereas this whole event takes place with him and Poison Ivy in the span of one holiday, which is Valentine's Day. Now, the outcome of the Valentine's Day book is exactly the same as the comic, thanks to Catwoman, but I was really surprised that they did that, because the book adds so much more depth to the situation by giving us more suspects about how Carla is a suspect, how Sophia shows up and she could be pegged as a suspect. And of course, the one thing that upsets me, and they keep doing this with every damn Batman movie, the Riddler gets shanked. I hate it. I hate it so much.
Yeah, I would have to agree. This is definitely where I start to get angry, because one, where you guys said, you know, you watched it together and you were surprised where it ended. I was shocked. I was like, really? That's where we're going to stop right now? This is just ridiculous. So I thought that the stopping point didn't make a lot of sense until you get to part 2. And then you're like, okay, I understand now, because now we're going to have to play this blended, you know, marriage of all of these different series. Again, book to movie, I'm not trying to discredit what the movie was doing, because at this point, a lot of what we're missing from Valentine's Day didn't really play into the movie. So, I mean, missing that dialogue made sense. But as a reader, having been so enriched in this comic and just absorbing its pages, I just felt kind of let down as a reader at that point, you know, like that's all we're going to get with Valentine's Day. And then, you know, St. Patrick's Day is essentially just going to be this lustful intertwine that you're just going to have this cat fight essentially between Poison Ivy and Catwoman, which didn't play into that beauty that was Poison Ivy. I mean, there was a lot that was going on with Poison Ivy, but I think that cinematically, that visionary of giving her that illustrious lore and, you know, just kind of putting Batman in that trance, I think kind of gave some segue to who she was, but it still, as a reader, just didn't do it for me. And then we continue the blending, which we'll talk about. And I don't know, to me, that was very lazy. I didn't like it, but I understood it, but I was disappointed in the same breath, you know?
What I really don't appreciate about as we move into this story is we just seem to me, I think Cammie hit the nose on the head, especially when it comes to the Rogues Gallery. It was very lazy. I mean, we didn't get the kind of depth that we thought that we were going to get from Poison Ivy. And once again, I'm going to ask this question later, but the fact that we get no Riddler, We don't get any true depth to Scarecrow. But then again, did we really get much depth to Scarecrow and Mad Hatter in this book? Honestly, not so much. I mean, I will definitely say that I think that there was a teensy bit more that was added to them in regards to what their purpose was for the story, because clearly when the Joker came into the picture, this was what set off Falcone's idea to say, well, we've got some crazies running around. Maybe I could use them to my advantage and let me start paying them to do my work for me to try and find this damn holiday killer. So I think we get a little bit more of that in the comic than we do in the movie. But in the movie, I just feel that these villains are just pushed a little bit further to the side. They get their screen time, but we don't really get too much of it, because I feel that Scarecrow's role in the story when it comes to the chapters of Mother's Day and Father's Day is so much richer. And also, some of the characters like Carla and Sophia are just also brushed to the side, because at this point in time, Sophia is on a freaking killing spree trying to find the holiday killer because she's scared that her father is going to die. And it's also really funny that there's a lot more depth to Sal Maroni in the book, because in the book, you see a much deeper relationship with his father, a la Godfather, pretty much, to the point where he literally has had it up to here. He says, that's it. I'm gonna help the good guys.
Yeah, and so I kind of alluded to it before, in that by killing Alberto, they decided to center like the rogues gallery part of this story. And while they pull off what the outcome is with like the big eruption in the office at the end and all of that, I think that, you know, to use the phrasing from before, if I needed to point out something that got my goat in this like whole thing, it's the choice to kill Alberto, because it's a strong choice, and it's one that they have to stick the landing on, of really recentering the entire story around the rogues gallery. They try to have their cake and eat it too, and I think the problem is that was a change that was made to shock fans who know the original story, to make sure that even if they didn't love the first part, they bought the second part just to be able to see what that change means. I think there's a version of telling this story where killing Alberto and having Gilda be the holiday killer for the entire time with, you know, a couple question marks, is a strong choice and interesting, and lets us do the long Halloween in terms of like spooky, what's out there, the things that are not the mob, the bigger villains we eventually see in Batman. Instead, what ended up happening was suddenly we needed to rush and replace the second half of the story, because all of the killing that being in the comic, first 3 killings, Gilda killings, next killings, Alberto killings. And as a result, we see in those killings, they're all mob focused. They're covering up evidence. They're dealing with battles in the mob war. It's all of that. But we try to, like, in this version, like, recolor what those murders are. And it's like all out of Gilda wanting Harvey to have a little less work, but also her vengeance. It gets murky for me. And it's weird that we still kill a lot of the same characters. It makes sense why we don't kill exclusively the same characters, why we need to create this other person to die instead of the coroner, and all of this kind of stuff. But it just starts to fall apart for me here, because it felt like we made a big change to make the fans go, wow, what does this mean? And then we didn't try particularly hard to make it meaningful.
All right, so let's just get the okay. We're going off on a little tangent here, but let's try and put a bow on this, Andy, because we're right here. Let's discuss this massive elephant in the room. How did you feel about the fact that this story turned from a story about a wife caring for the well-being of her husband to a flat-out revenge story involving the exact same person? So if this is the time to start talking about Gilda, let's talk about Gilda.
The thing is, it's a change that theoretically I could have been fine with, that I think was done very poorly. I think there's a version of retelling this story where they make Gilda more of her own character, center her a little bit more, make the twist that she's the holiday killer more interesting and like foreseeable. And they do put in more clues in this than are in the book for that reason. But it just didn't work for me to have her be the killer continuously. Yes, it gives us like a nice beat for Harvey, like near the end during that added street fight, like in the street with Grundy and all of that stuff. But it just, motivations aside, I have no problems with the shift to a vengeance story versus a helping Harvey story. All of that could have been done well. I just feel like the fun of the Long Halloween comes from like all the different suspects. And I feel like part 2 was an exercise in writing out the red herrings. I mean, Steve, you were just talking about like Sophia is on like a killing spree right now in the comics, right? And Sophia doesn't do shit in the movie.
No, she doesn't.
It's weird.
Even the relationship that she actually has with Sal Maroni doesn't add to the story in the movie. In the book, it's a crucial thing. Like, wait a minute, maybe she does have other motivations, but we don't know what they are just yet. Unfortunately, she ends up getting caught in the crossfire, so we're never going to know that answer. But yeah, we see that in the Father's Day segment because she's the one that drove Sal to his dad. And I'm like, okay, this really, why? Where are we going with this?
It was bizarre. It was bizarre. It's we had all these red herrings in the comic book, which is like an integral part of the mystery story and like the telling of a mystery story. And in the movie, we were like, of all the things that we decided we didn't have time for, it was coming up with like alternate suspects.
No, the one thing that they didn't have time for that upsets me is they hated on the Riddler. Why? Why, Andy? Why do they hate the Riddler so much in animation? Please, someone answer this question for me. I'm dying here.
He's quirky. I don't know. Maybe they don't like the color green. I really never understood why the Riddler just doesn't get his dues. I love the Riddler. He's one of my favorite Batman villains just because I love the idea and you know, centering around Enigma and the puzzles, and you know, just it adds a different dynamic to the relationship that Batman shares with each of his villains. It's like, I don't know, it's a puzzle. I mean, the Riddler really is a puzzle because it just shows that Batman has this innate connection to each of these villains, and it just works like a clock, you know. But let's just say they completely just swept over April Fool's Day. It doesn't even exist in the movie, which I was like, what the hell is going on here?
Yeah.
And so there's the Riddler for you. And then you get the marriage of Mother's Day and Father's Day, which in my opinion, that's kind of where the story starts to lessen for me in terms of the movie, because you miss the rich dialogue and the detective work that happens in Mother's Day and Father's Day within our comic. And it completely eliminates the importance of Carla, Viti, and Sophia. And to me, it's like, okay, well then now they're just these chicks in this flick, and that's irritating. As a female watching it, it takes the power away from these women. These are badass women, you know, two very big prominent figureheads. I mean, for Christ's sake, they had more power than the kid did, you know. And so when you can show that you have these powerhouse females, and then you have this kind of backstory that links the two mafia main families, and then you just kind of sweep it under the rug, like us as readers aren't going to notice that. Again, a slap in the face to me as the reader. You know, I'm appreciating what you're doing in terms of creating this vengeance story, which, agreeing with Andy here, I can very much get behind that and I can support that. But don't take this great comic series that I just got done digesting and then try and water it down. It's like getting 2% milk and adding water to it, you know. It was just kind of like, really? You know, this is what I get?
Because you want to know what I really think is so interesting and important about the Riddler is we've had this conversation before, but here's where I really want to iterate on it a lot more. What I really appreciate about Riddler is, yes, he is part of Batman's rogues gallery, but he's not one of those guys that is truly like threatening to the humankind. His main objective in his life is to just outsmart Batman. And I think that's why I appreciate him being one of the hires at the beginning of Falcone, because he is one of those villains that teeters on sanity and insanity, because he is a smart man. That's one of the few things about him that I love. Out of all of Batman's Rogues Gallery, he's one of the very few whose mind, in my opinion, is still very much intact, because he's still able to do what he does. And he is part of this story to try and help Falcone solve the mystery without the use of violence. And it's just so funny because at the end of April Fool's Day, he's the one that gets outlined with bullet holes and doesn't get a single shot towards him. And then he has that last riddle at the end of the book. That's what I really liked about this specific character in the story. And I think one of the other things that really upset me about the movie is some of the things that they took, because then we go into areas like Independence Day. Like, I don't even remember Independence Day in the movie. I just remember the fireworks. That's it. And this meeting of the three on the dock. And that's another thing. The fact that they added all of this drama between Harvey and Gilda about having children, I just didn't see the value in that. And I feel that they took a lot away to give more to Catwoman, because Catwoman's motivation in the story, in the book, we never seem to understand it. But in the movie, she's trying to find out if Carmine Falcone is her dad. Like, I just don't understand that
that's
point.
Dark Victory, by the way. That's the influence of, in order to give Catwoman more to do in part 2, pulling in a little bit of what's going on in Dark Victory to give context.
Understood. Thank you.
So you know. Yeah.
Okay. I just don't think it fits in this story, if I'm being honest with you.
I mean, that's why it wasn't in this story. That's why it was in Dark Victory. So
exactly.
That's
exactly.
But also, I mean, in fairness, we did have the discussion when talking about the book about what's the point of Catwoman here, other than to have Catwoman present. I mean, this was something we talked about. So yeah. I appreciate that they gave it their best shot, but what you're saying makes complete sense. I do think adding in the kind of like, kids, we should have kids, like kind of thing makes sense in the context of it's part of Gilda's new motivation in this movie for what her vengeance centers around. So I get that too, for sure. But I don't know. It just kind of feels like I put a lot of the blame of part 2 on the twist ending of part 1, because part 1 played it so close to the book until they decided to shock people who have read it. And then part 2 needed to deal with that decision. And it turns out it was just very not artful. It's what I got. Like,
because when we get to Roman Holiday, that's where we get to the trial. And the funny thing is, in the book, the trial starts much earlier. I mean, for crying out loud, Alfred is on the stand at one point in time, which I find so interesting. And the trial is extremely different in the comic, because in the comic, Maroni had motivations that were very different from the comic itself. Like, he literally tells Harvey everything, and then in the movie, when he's finally put on the stand, he just wants to make Harvey look dumb. And that's when the transformation from Harvey Dent to Two-Face takes place.
I didn't fully get to have my rant about the lack of Scarecrow and the Mad Hatter, though.
Go for it.
I feel like the blend of Mother's Day, Father's Day, and in my opinion, Independence Day is kind of what happened there. Is you get this insane spotlight on Scarecrow, and then the Mad Hatter kind of just gets fluffed to the side. They kind of make, this little riddle out of him. And come on, those are two of the best villains that never get the most screen time, and this was a perfect opportunity to give them some depth, and we just kind of use them as pawns. And I think that in a way it was kind of a replacement for the strong female leads. I think that this was very male center forward, and I think that is why they got the spotlight that they got, but I still don't think either one of them were given enough justice. And then it just kind of like smushes us into the Roman holiday, and I'm like, really, that's all we get?
Yeah.
So again, understanding the flow of the story and where we're headed, I know why it happened, but as a lover of those two villains, I mean, severely, I love the Scarecrow and the Mad Hatter so much, and I just love when they get any kind of writing and given the context of how much they were a part of this series, I was just like, yes, we're gonna get great screen time for them, and then we didn't.
I think
So, yeah,
I think I
was
probably mentioned when we talk
really
about the book,
disappointed.
Cammy, but this is another opportunity I will take to say I'm pretty sure you still haven't read Arkham Asylum, but you should read Arkham Asylum when
Yeah,
you
I need
get a
to read that
chance to.
again.
I did buy it though. I did buy
Okay.
it, so I'm one step into the game.
Sweet.
I
I
bought it
haven't
with our
gotten it
last
yet.
conversation.
That was all. That was all. I just that was the mo. I didn't mean to interrupt the point. It's just that point was so tied to. I'm sure I said it during our book conversation.
Yeah,
You should read Arkham
I need to get myself a copy of Arkham Asylum. I have not read that book in years. I know they just made a brand new edition. I just need to get it. Yeah. One of the other things that I also want to say, Cammie, I agree with you, because for crying out loud, the movie even gives the opportunity for Penguin to say one line, but they can't even give any depth to Scarecrow and Mad Hatter. I'm like, why did they give Penguin that one line? You know, I just didn't understand. But I think it's time to really start going into the end of the story, and that's where we get into Labor Day and the final chapter, because that's really where everything this is where these two stories start to truly, I think that this is where you could definitely say now is the time to just look at the book and look at the films and look at them as separate entities. Just don't compare them, because these are not the same thing anymore. I mean, clearly it happens a little bit earlier, but it really is towards the last act of the second film where it really starts to make that statement. Because I'm just going to say what happens, and then you guys just take the reins. We see the death of Carla. We see Batman call Harvey Dent out before he officially becomes Two-Face. Alberto makes his big return. Maroni and Falcone. Did Carmine even die in the movie? I don't remember him dying.
Yeah, he shoots him, doesn't he?
I don't remember.
Harvey shoots him after the flip. Did I make that up?
I think in the book he dies.
It tells you how like bizarre I found the movie that I rewatched it last night and I'm forgetting if Carmine dies at the end of part 2.
Yeah, and in the movie, like, Harvey is called out by Gilda, which is so weird, you know? So guys, just go, because this is just where it gets to become a big convoluted mess.
And I think it's telling, because we've been already talking about part 2 like that, because the book is so structured, you know, whether it's your cup of tea or not, by centering it around the holiday killings, it makes, you know, in hindsight, you can look back at the issues as very individual entities. We can talk about it like by holiday. It's almost like, you know, in the book when Carmine's like, you know what my men call this last year? I feel like, you know what they call these last 6 months, the very long Valentine's Day, because that's what it was, right? It just suddenly the structure that we had goes away, and they use the structure in the first part of the film, and then they don't in the second part of the film. And it makes sense, because that's where they suddenly needed to be doing stuff of their own creation instead of doing adaptation. I don't know. It's one of those things where it all snowballs from the decision they made at the end of part 1. And you kind of see why that wasn't a great choice, because it just sort of unravels at this point. Also, I really should mention, we didn't talk about the added scene with Bruce as a little kid getting the coin from Carmine.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's a thing that happened. I only raised that to say it's a little difference that we didn't talk about, but and the scene where, like, you know, they're freeing all the inmates from Arkham Asylum and all that, and they have Calendar Man bang on the glass. Like, I meant heads. Can I just say that I thought it would have been a really artful thing there to be like, you know, he says, like, I meant heads. To say I meant tails, like to imply that Harvey had already done something to the coin at that point. I think that would have been really neat if he was like, I got the coin flip wrong because Harvey has changed the coin and we didn't see it happen yet.
Yeah, again,
Anyway,
I think
whatever.
I know
That's
I
just the thing I thought.
but you see, I'm glad that you're saying that because this just shows you what Cammy has been saying this entire time.
Oh, yeah.
How part two literally blends everything. You completely forget the
Yes.
fact that in the movie, Bruce gets the coin. That
Yeah.
event is taking place in the book, sans the coin. The only thing that really bothered me about that is why did an 8-year-old boy sound like a prepubescent 12-year-old?
I
was so shocked when he started speaking.
I think that scene is always added because it's a reminder to maybe a newer fan to the Batman realm that, you know, this is kind of where Batman's mind always centers back to is the death of his parents, and his whole mission, his drive, his purpose goes back to that moment where that is where Bruce Wayne changed forever. His path and his mission of life changed at that point. So even if it is just a bleep, I think it's important in the cinematic world to always kind of add reference to that, even if it is for just a glimmer, because it reminds us as the fans why he's doing what he's doing, what his drive is, you know, in terms of whatever the case may be, whatever the mission at hand is. But all of this blending that we're referencing and this irritation of it and that change, I mean, we understand the blend, we understand the why, we know why certain main characters in the reference of the book version changed to the movie version because obviously the reference point of the main character changed. But for me as a reader, again, another disappointment. We've mentioned this early on in our discussion that this is the origin story of Harvey Dent becoming Two-Face, and I really think that that takes a lot away from it. When you make her the focus and it becomes a revenge story, all of the points that lead us to the anger and this, you know, this just really horrible man are taken away, and you don't get the shock value in the courtroom when the acid is thrown in his face like you do reading it, because that's just kind of been stripped from you. And I feel very cheated again as the reader watching the movie because I don't get that same impact of Harvey Dent becoming Two-Face as I did watching it unfold in the pages, you know. So although I can appreciate what they did with her and I loved the revenge story that was created, I really felt like maybe that could have been like an alternate version that DC created somewhere instead of trying to ruin my Long Halloween.
Yeah, I hear that. I definitely do. And look, you know, I'm a fan. I'm not a writer. Like, I feel like maybe when they were starting to put this project together, there was a version of the script that was a lot more regimented with the holidays and tried to get them to fit with the new narrative they decided they were going to tell around Gilda. And maybe they realized either this would be 4 movies or this doesn't work in the same way with it being Gilda. There's too many here. Like, no matter how we write this revenge story, we can't rewrite the entire mob around this. So I give them that benefit of the doubt. However, and I think this is exactly what you're getting at, Cammy, that's just not the story that The Long Halloween was trying to tell in the first place. And while we can look at it going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation as these are 2 different beasts, so judge it by its own merits, it's hard to do that when this was billed really as the animated form of this story.
That's right.
And since part 1 tracks with it so closely until they do a twist seemingly for the sake of doing a twist.
Yeah.
So it makes me view part 2 far more harshly than I think I otherwise would have.
And I've never, and I told Steve this from the beginning, the very first watching or viewing of this movie, that I didn't like how it was broken up. But I think that had they kept on the notion of where they started in part 1, this could have easily been a very cinematically beautiful masterpiece if they would have done it in 4 parts. I know that sounds crazy, but I think they could have created the story that we read and loved and made it to where we weren't blending and rushing and made it seem as though they were just force feeding us this story. And I also feel that the revenge story that was created could have stood alone as an alternative ending, either in the post credits or as like a B-side to the disc, and allowed us to kind of see a different version of it. And it would have still worked flawlessly. I think we would have still appreciated it like we do, and you know how we're conversing about it. It really does work, and it gives us some depth to some other characters that we don't necessarily get in the story. But as a reader, I want to see this enveloped into a cinematic retelling. You know, give me my story, don't give me what your interpretation is of it, because I do feel that there are certain stories that just need to be told, and The Long Halloween is one of those stories. There's just so much richness and depth to the story that you feel cheated when you get the version that you receive.
Yeah, and at the end,
that's just my 2 cents.
And at the end of the movie, you see that Bruce and Selena have a relationship, a very seemingly something that's going to grow into something. And to me, that seemed like something that really comes more from Hush, unless that also comes from Dark Victory, Andy. I don't know. But let's talk about that ending, because the ending is very much the same except for one little piece. In the end of The Long Halloween, we have Gilda doing an inner monologue and basically revealing that she is the holiday killer, which means no one ever solved the mystery. But in the movie, there she is talking to Batman, because Batman figured it out.
This was a complaint a lot of people had about the original. They feel like there was something lacking, that Batman wasn't able to figure it out since he is, you know, the world's greatest detective. I judge that a little less harshly because I do see this as an early career Batman thing. I don't think he's the prepared for every eventuality, you know, it's funny, the only word I have is superhero, and that is accurate. The prepared for every eventuality superhero that he is eventually, so that doesn't really bother me too much. I think it's fine to let Batman like figure it out in this story. I think there's some people who are probably happy for that change. For me, it was a whole lot of like, I guess we wanted a reason for her to speak out loud. And I don't hate it. I don't like it. I just think it was fine. It was just, they did it different, and that's okay.
Honestly, there's something that I have to say. You know, at the beginning when I saw this was something that I actually didn't have any issues with, but now I sort of have a little bit of an issue with it, because at the end of all of this, The Long Halloween was only to show us how Batman gets into the Justice League in this brand new storyline, because there's a post-credit scene where trick-or-treaters come to the door at Wayne Manor, and it's Green Arrow and the Flash.
Yeah.
And I'm saying to myself, oh, this was actually part of an entire new DC animated film storyline. That was weird. And the reason why I say that is because it reminded me of something that was said a long time ago when Man of Steel by Zack Snyder had just hit theaters. And Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy was literally just ending, and how everyone was saying, oh, wouldn't it be great if these two characters actually were in a movie together? Because this was before all the DCEU, and Christopher Nolan was the person that said, my Batman cannot live in the DC world. When you take a look at a story like The Long Halloween, and you had just watched movies like Superman, Man of Tomorrow, and Justice Society World War II, which involves the Flash, how the hell does this Batman live in this world? I am curious to see where this new, what is now called Rebirth DC Animated Universe timeline is going to be further on down this road, because it was funny when I saw that happen, just because of the fact that, again, it was Alfred who looks at the door and he sees him and he goes, it's for you, sir. And I'm just like, how is this going to work?
Yeah, I didn't even pay attention to that really. It jarred me. It kind of pulled me out of the story until you made mention of it, Steve, and told me that you actually liked it when you first saw it. And the more I saw it, the less I liked it, because again, it takes away from the rich darkness that the Long Halloween is. And then as you guys were kind of talking about, you know, all these different subtle changes in the end, and we're talking about all these intense mashups to just kind of get us to the finality, I was thinking too on my thought process of, you know, having an alternative ending. What if we did like a coin flip and got Gilda's story? You see what I did there?
Yeah.
but no, I just think that that was cheesy. It was funny, yes, but I think that's also where DC tries to compete with Marvel, because Marvel always does something kind of comedic in the end of their story, you know, and there's always a lot of jokes and stuff. I don't like that when DC tries to do it, because part of the lore of DC is that dark side. And a lot of the storylines that we get from DC are very dark and dismal. And there's no happy ending. There's no rainbow. I mean, all of our villains come from very tragic beginnings. And that is the beauty that is DC. So stop trying to Marvel my DC. Just let it be.
I think what we're definitely going to do sometime in the future, especially because with the DC animated live show really taking a brand new shape and form on this channel, I think that we're definitely going to have to revisit the now called New 52 storyline. And I think if Andy, if you want to join us for a couple of those episodes, that would be great, because what was very interesting about that specific series of DC animated films was how they actually took two big comic book stories and put them into this specific story timeline. And I just want to say, and we'll obviously revisit it and talk about it in more depth, it worked for the death and reign of the Supermen, but it didn't work for Batman Hush. And I think it's just because of the fact that those kinds of Batman stories are very much on another level. They really are. And again, I feel that knowing that this Long Halloween film is part of this rebirth timeline, I think it just takes a little bit more away from it than it does add to it, which is why I think it's safe to say in conclusion that we all will once again say the books are definitely better than the film.
Yeah. I mean, it's not one of the best DC animated films, but it's a contender for the best Batman story ever told. So it's, you know, like that alone would have disqualified it from the beginning. But, you know, I should say we got very negative talking about part 2. I still enjoyed myself watching it. The problem is when it's the source material that great, you judge it really harshly, and it's very hard to like put that aside. But it's one of those things where like, I don't even know if it was good enough for me to like want to come back to this one in the way I do with something like Dark Knight Returns or the Year One animation. But it was enjoyable, and I think fans should give it a shot. And, you know, if for no reason other than it is fun and shocking at the end of part 1 when Alberto dies brutally. You don't get that moment in anything else. If you're a fan of it and you see that, whether it's cheap or not, it makes you go, oh, wow, where are we going from here? It turns out nowhere particularly novel, but it's a fun moment for fans to have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really curious to see where we will be going in the future, because clearly Cammie and I, and you, Andy, of course, we have a Who Wore It Best episode of Superman Red Sun on the horizon. We have a Justice League New Frontier episode on the horizon. We have All-Star Superman. So there are so many great comic book stories that have been adapted by this DC animation team that are going to be really exciting to tackle when we get into 2022. So here's what I'm just going to basically say. I am definitely going to say the books are great. You've got to read this story, especially if you want to read truly, debatably, one of the greatest Batman stories of all time. You want to see a very well done, mature Batman film minus its shortcomings. This is definitely one of them. I will definitely say that I have seen worse when it comes to the DC animated film library, when it comes to Batman adaptations. But It is what it is, and this is where we stand. So, Andy, Cammie, it was great to have another amazing conversation with the both of you. And I am hoping that we are going to have many more of these in 2022 because there is still so much ground that we have to cover. And based on a lot of things that I have been doing off camera, there are definitely some Who Wore It Best episodes on the horizon, and definitely some must-be-reads on the horizon that we definitely need to discuss and plan for, because this year has definitely been unusual. It definitely, we're still, I think, finding our niche here and our flow, but I think we're going to get it right in 2022. So everybody, I just want to say thank you very much for watching, and we hope that you have a very safe and happy holiday season, and we will see you in the next one.